On the morning of May 27, 1940, German soldiers crouched behind burned-out vehicles and shattered stone walls outside the French port of Dunkirk, watching something they could not explain. 300,000 British and French troops were trapped on the beaches below. The Wehrmacht had them surrounded. German artillery hammered the sand. Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the clouds. Every calculation said the same thing. This was the end of Britain's army. But the men on the beaches were not behaving like a defeated force. German troops watched through binoculars as long, silent lines of British soldiers stood waist-deep in the freezing Channel water. They waited for hours under constant air attack. They did not scatter. They did not panic. When bombs fell, they ducked, then stood back up and calmly resumed their place in line. A German officer wrote in his diary that night that he had never seen anything like it. The British were being destroyed, yet they acted as if they were merely boarding trains for a holiday. He found it deeply unsettling. This was not what German soldiers had been taught to expect. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the British as soft, decadent, unwilling to fight a real war. They were supposed to collapse once faced with modern mechanized violence. Blitzkrieg had crushed Poland in weeks. It had shattered France in days. Britain's small expeditionary force was supposed to dissolve under pressure. Instead, German soldiers at Dunkirk witnessed something that did not fit their training manuals. The British waited. They waited while shells tore gaps into the sand around them. They waited while aircraft strafed the beaches again and again. They waited knowing that the boats might never come, knowing that capture or death was only a matter of time. And still, they waited in discipline. As night fell, German soldiers watched small civilian boats appear on the horizon. Fishing vessels, pleasure craft, tugs, they moved slowly through smoke and fire, feeding men off the beaches and toward larger ships offshore. The Germans had won the battle. They had driven the British from the continent. But as the last ship slipped away into the darkness, many German soldiers felt something was wrong. One war correspondent later wrote that it felt like watching a wounded animal escape into the forest. You knew you had hurt it badly, but you also knew it would survive. What the Germans were witnessing at Dunkirk was more than an evacuation. It was the first crack in everything they believed about the British soldier. And it would trouble them for the next 5 years. In the days that followed Dunkirk, German soldiers tried to make sense of what they had seen. The campaign in the West had unfolded exactly as planned. Poland had fallen in weeks. France had collapsed in days. The Wehrmacht had moved faster than anyone believed possible. Victory felt inevitable. And yet something about the British, refused to fit the pattern. German commanders had expected mass surrender. Instead, they encountered rearguard actions that bordered on the suicidal. Small British units held crossroads, ports, and towns long after any hope of escape had vanished. They fought, knowing they were buying time with their lives. At Calais, roughly 4,000 British troops were ordered to hold the port. The message from London was blunt. Evacuation would not take place. For 4 days, they resisted overwhelming German forces, street by street, building by building. When the garrison finally surrendered, it was shattered. German soldiers clearing the town wrote home in disbelief. They had expected a quick collapse. Instead, it had taken 3 times longer than planned to dislodge defenders who refused to give ground. Every hour those men held Calais was an hour gained for the evacuation at Dunkirk. Similar actions unfolded across northern France. At Arras, a small British tank counterattack caught German commanders completely off guard. For several hours, senior officers believed they were facing a major offensive. One German division commander later described it as the most critical moment of the entire French campaign. It was not the scale of the attack that shocked them. It was the fact that the British were still attacking at all. These encounters forced German soldiers to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The British soldier was not weak. He was not eager to surrender. He did not panic when encircled. When ordered to hold, he held, often until destruction was inevitable. This behavior contradicted everything German propaganda had promised. Letters sent home during the summer of 1940 reveal confusion more than hatred. One non-commissioned officer wrote that the English were either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily foolish. He could not decide which. Another admitted that fighting them felt different from fighting the French or Belgians. The British did not collapse. They absorbed punishment and continued. The evacuation itself deepened that confusion. Germany had won a decisive military victory. Britain had abandoned nearly all its heavy equipment. By any rational measure, the war should have been over. Peace overtures were expected, negotiations assumed. Instead, Britain did something the Germans did not understand. It refused to accept defeat. British radio broadcasts carried Churchill's speeches across the channel, defiant, uncompromising. Germany listened as a nation that had lost its army spoke openly of continuing the war. For German soldiers, this was baffling. They had destroyed Britain's position on the continent, yet Britain behaved as if it had gained something. In truth, it had. What survived Dunkirk was not equipment or territory. What survived was the British Army itself, and more importantly, its belief that it could endure. German soldiers sensed it, even if they could not yet explain it. The enemy they had been told would break had escaped intact in spirit. The war with Britain was not over. It had only just begun. In the summer of 1940, German soldiers waited for the war with Britain to conclude. Everything pointed toward it. France had fallen. The British Army had fled the continent. Britain stood alone, stripped of its heavy weapons and surrounded by hostile seas. By every strategic calculation, resistance was irrational. The expectation inside the Wehrmacht was simple. Britain would negotiate. Instead, the opposite happened. German listening stations intercepted British radio broadcasts night after night. They heard a new tone in British leadership, defiant, uncompromising, openly confrontational. Winston Churchill spoke not of peace, but of endurance, not of compromise, but of resistance at any cost. For German soldiers, this was deeply confusing. They had not merely defeated Britain in France, they had shattered its position in Europe, and yet Britain behaved as if it had escaped disaster rather than suffered it. One German non-commissioned officer wrote to his brother that the English were acting like victors after a defeat. He could not understand it. Many German soldiers believed Britain was making a terrible mistake. They assumed that once the Luftwaffe began its assault, British morale would collapse. The bombing of cities, factories, and airfields would force the British government to come to terms. That was how wars ended. Pressure was applied, resistance cracked. But during the Battle of Britain, something unexpected happened again. British pilots continued to fly, even as losses mounted. Airfields were bombed repeatedly, yet operations resumed within hours. Civilian populations endured nightly air raids without the mass panic German planners had predicted. German aircrews noticed it first. Pilots shot down over England were surprised by the calm they encountered. Instead of hatred or chaos, many were met by disciplined soldiers, organized civil defense, and civilians who looked exhausted but unbroken. Reports filtered back through prisoner interrogations and letters. Britain was absorbing punishment and refusing to bend. By the autumn of 1940, Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was quietly postponed, then indefinitely delayed. For German soldiers, this was the first time the war had failed to move forward. They had been trained for momentum. Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was a philosophy. Speed created collapse, collapse created victory. But Britain did not collapse. It stalled the war in place. This forced German soldiers to reassess their enemy. The British soldier was no longer viewed simply as the man who had escaped at Dunkirk. He became something else entirely, an obstacle that refused to be removed, a professional who endured pressure rather than yielding to it. Letters from late 1940 reveal a shift in tone. There is still contempt, still mockery, but it is mixed with unease. One soldier wrote that the English fought like men who had already accepted suffering. Another remarked that they seemed stubborn beyond logic. The British refusal to surrender had consequences far beyond morale. It forced Germany into a war it had not planned to fight. Resources meant for other campaigns were tied down in the West. Aircraft, crews, and time were consumed without decisive result. The war became longer, more complicated, more dangerous. German soldiers did not yet speak of respect, but they no longer spoke of weakness. Britain had been knocked down, and instead of staying down, it had dug in. For the first time, German soldiers began to sense that this enemy would not be finished quickly or easily. The war between Germany and Britain changed character in the deserts of North Africa. Here, there were no cheering crowds, no cities to occupy, no swift collapses, only vast distances, relentless heat, and armies forced to fight far from home with fragile supply lines. When German forces arrived in Libya in early 1941, many soldiers believed they would finally finish what had begun in France. The British Eighth Army had already suffered defeats against Italy. The desert appeared open, empty, vulnerable. What German soldiers encountered instead was an enemy they would come to understand far better. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the Afrika Korps, paid close attention to the British soldier. In his letters and reports, he described them with a tone that was markedly different from propaganda. He criticized their rigidity, their caution, their reliance on doctrine. But he did not question their courage. He wrote that British troops would stand and fight to the end when ordered to hold a position. That once dug in, they were extremely difficult to dislodge. They endured artillery fire, air attack, and isolation with remarkable discipline. German soldiers in the desert noticed it too. British units absorbed punishment that would have shattered less disciplined forces. They did not retreat in panic. They withdrew when ordered, often under heavy fire, and regrouped to fight again. German officers remarked that British troops were predictable, but reliable. If they held ground, they held it stubbornly. This mixture of admiration and frustration became a recurring theme. Nowhere was it clearer than at Tobruk. The Libyan port fell under siege in April 1941. The garrison, composed of British, Australian, Indian, and Polish troops, was cut off, outnumbered, and expected to surrender quickly. German doctrine predicted collapse. Instead, Tobruk became a nightmare. For 241 days, the defenders held. German assaults were repelled again and again. Infantry attacks failed. Armored thrusts stalled. Artillery bombardments achieved nothing decisive. One German officer wrote that attacking Tobruk was like attacking a wall made of bayonets. Rommel needed the port desperately. Without it, his supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across the desert. Every failed assault bled his army. Every day, Tobruk held strengthened British resolve. German soldiers wrote home, describing the defenders as fanatics, not because they lacked reason, but because they refused to accept defeat when logic said they should. The desert itself reshaped how enemies saw each other. Both sides suffered equally. Temperatures soared during the day and plunged at night. Sandstorms blinded men and engines alike. Water shortages made every canteen precious. Disease and exhaustion killed as surely as bullets. In this shared hardship, a strange professionalism emerged. German soldiers wrote about watching British positions through binoculars, seeing men just like themselves, dirty, exhausted, enduring. They read letters left behind in abandoned camps. Some admitted that reading a British soldier's words to his wife made the enemy feel uncomfortably familiar. This was not ideological war. It was war between soldiers. Prisoners were usually treated correctly. Rommel insisted on humane treatment for captured British troops and expected the same in return. Many German soldiers came to believe that surrendering to the British meant survival, not revenge. The turning point came in late 1942 at El Alamein. There, German soldiers encountered something new. The British attacked with overwhelming force. Thousands of guns opened fire at once. Air superiority was absolute. The battlefield shook for days. German counterattacks were crushed before they could gather momentum. German veterans later said that at El Alamein, the British finally fought the way they had always feared, slow, methodical, and unstoppable. Rommel's army was broken. Retreat followed retreat, ending in Tunisia and surrender in 1943. By then, German soldiers no longer doubted the British soldiers' quality. They criticized British generals. They mocked British caution, but they respected the men in the ranks. The desert had stripped away illusion. What remained was a clear judgment formed under fire. The British soldier was a professional opponent, difficult to defeat, unwilling to panic, and capable of enduring far more than Germany had expected. By 1942, German perceptions of the British soldier had shifted from confusion to respect. But respect was not the end of the story. Behind the front lines, another British war was being fought, one that German soldiers and commanders found far more unsettling. It began quietly. Captured German officers, especially senior ones, were sent not to barbed wire camps but to country houses in England. One of the most important was Trent Park, a stately mansion north of London. There, German generals were treated with remarkable courtesy. Private rooms, good food, walks in the gardens. They believed they were safe. They were not. Every room in Trent Park was wired with hidden microphones. Every conversation was recorded. German officers spoke freely, unaware that British intelligence was listening to every word. What they said revealed more than any interrogation ever could. In these private conversations, German generals spoke candidly about the war and about their enemies. Again and again, the same themes appeared. British soldiers were competent, professional, disciplined. Once established in defensive positions, they were extremely difficult to dislodge. Their artillery was particularly feared. The surprise was not that the British fought well. The surprise was that Germany had underestimated them so badly. One general admitted that he had expected Britain to collapse after France fell. Another said the British decision to fight on alone defied logic, but had to be respected. Several remarked that British troops were careful with their lives, refusing to attack without overwhelming preparation. These were not propaganda statements. These were unguarded confessions. But the most unsettling German assessments came not from conventional battles, but from something else entirely. British commandos. Almost immediately after Dunkirk, Britain began striking back. Small units crossed the sea at night, raiding occupied coasts, ports, and installations. Early operations achieved little militarily, but psychologically, they hit hard. German garrisons could no longer feel safe. Raids came without warning. A few men would appear out of the darkness, strike violently, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Supplies were destroyed, prisoners were taken, installations burned. Then, the Desert War added something new. The Special Air Service and the Long-Range Desert Group began operating hundreds of miles behind German lines. Small teams destroyed aircraft on the ground, sabotaged fuel dumps, and disappeared into the wilderness. German pilots landed on airfields they believed secure, only to find wreckage smoldering on the sand. German officers described the raiders as ghosts. They could not be pinned down. They could not be predicted. Entire units were diverted to guard airfields and supply lines against enemies who might never appear and might already be gone. The frustration reached the highest levels. Adolf Hitler took the raids personally. He saw them not as military operations, but as humiliation. The Atlantic Wall was ordered in response to British raiding pressure. Thousands of bunkers stretched across Europe's coastline. Still, the raids continued. In October 1942, Hitler issued the Commando Order. It declared that all Allied commandos captured in Europe or Africa were to be executed immediately, even if they attempted to surrender. It was an illegal order, a war crime. But it revealed something critical. You do not issue death sentences for enemies you consider weak. The order was meant to terrorize British special forces into stopping. It failed. Raids continued. Men went behind enemy lines knowing capture might mean death. German soldiers understood what this meant. The British soldier they had once dismissed had produced warriors so dangerous that normal rules no longer applied. Respect had turned into fear. Not fear of British numbers, not fear of British equipment, fear of British men who struck without warning, fought without hesitation, and disappeared without trace. By the middle of the war, German soldiers no longer asked whether the British could fight. They asked where and when they might strike next. By the summer of 1944, German soldiers faced a very different British army from the one they had chased to the sea 4 years earlier. On June 6th, Allied forces landed in Normandy. German defenses had been prepared for years. Concrete bunkers, minefields, artillery positions, yet the invasion still achieved surprise. Allied deception had misled the German high command, leaving critical reserves far from the beaches. When British and Canadian troops came ashore at Gold Sword and Juno, Germans, defenders were struck by the scale of what confronted them. This was not desperation. This was precision. Landing craft arrived on schedule. Units moved inland in disciplined waves. Naval gunfire struck with terrifying accuracy. Artillery followed closely behind. German veterans later described the experience as fighting against an industrial force rather than an army. One German officer said it felt like battling a factory that produced endless firepower. But what impressed them most was not the equipment, it was the control. British units advanced methodically. They consolidated gains before pushing forward. When counterattacked, they did not break. They absorbed the blow, called in artillery, and resumed the advance. German counteroffensives repeatedly stalled against British defensive positions that refused to collapse. The fighting in Normandy was brutal and slow. Cities like Caen became grinding battles of attrition. German soldiers noticed the same pattern again and again. The British did not rush. They did not gamble. They prepared, advanced, and endured. To German veterans, this confirmed what they had learned since North Africa. The British soldier was not reckless. He was not impulsive. He fought as part of a system designed to preserve lives while applying overwhelming force. As the war drew toward its end, German soldiers faced choices about survival. Those who could fled west. They preferred surrender to British or American forces rather than face capture by the Red Army. They believed, correctly, that surrendering to the British meant food, medical care, and survival. Prisoner accounts consistently described correct treatment, discipline, and adherence to the laws of war. This mattered deeply. The war in the West was brutal, but it was bounded. German soldiers sensed the difference. They fought hard against the British, but without the desperate fury that defined the Eastern Front. After 1945, German veterans were often asked about their former enemies. Their answers, recorded decades later, were remarkably consistent. British soldiers were professional, disciplined, tough under fire. Their artillery was excellent. Their logistics were formidable. They did not panic easily. They treated prisoners correctly. The criticisms were equally consistent. British leadership was cautious, predictable, methodical to a fault. The British preferred overwhelming force to daring maneuvers. They won wars by grinding forward rather than by dramatic breakthroughs. But even these criticisms carried an undertone of respect. One German veteran summed it up simply. The British soldier was the best enemy one could ask for. He fought hard, he fought fairly, and when the war was over, he did not seek revenge. Former enemies met again after the war, at reunions, at battlefields, at cemeteries where British and German graves lie only meters apart. Enemies in life, neighbors in death. The German opinion of the British soldier was never simple. It was respect mixed with frustration, admiration tempered by criticism, fear, in the case of commandos, professional recognition earned over years of combat. The Germans had gone to war believing the British would be weak. They came away knowing better. The British soldier had been beaten, bombed, encircled, and driven from a continent, and yet he had returned, better equipped, better trained, and unbroken in spirit. That is what German soldiers ultimately understood. The British deserved respect, and in war, that may be the highest judgment an enemy can give.